Hey there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. If you're interested, check it out, but with that, let's jump in and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a small liner brush, and as per usual, we'll dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water and begin wiping off the excess. This will condense the bristles and allow us to move the paint a little bit easier. Also, for our palette, we will be working with some titanium white and Mars black to begin with. We'll be doing the entirety of the painting with a layer of gray essentially, and then we'll glaze on the color in the later steps. But with that, let's start right here in our reflections. Now we'll begin here by grabbing a good amount of our titanium white, moving that to a clean spot on our palette, grabbing maybe 1/10 that in Mars black, and this is going to dilute that pigment, make it quite a bit darker, but it still is relatively bright in reference to the canvas. So I'll grab a little bit more water, grab some of that pigment, take my pinky finger, ground it on the canvas to eliminate shake from my hand, and then in all of these drawn on strips of light, I'm going to work horizontally back and forth from one side to the other, attempting to get fairly straight application. And when I do this, I'm sometimes leaving a little bit of a space in between my strokes. And that's essentially just going to show that there is a difference in height in the ground. Sometimes there are little divots. They're not going to catch that same amount of light. Sometimes water is going to pool differently. And something else I'm trying to do is I almost start applying real pressure in the middle. And then as I get towards the left and the right hand side, I relieve pressure with my brush. And this ends up creating a smaller stroke. This is important because it makes it look tapered on both sides. And you get that nice, more thick body. You can also go back over previous applications, as we will numerous times, and that's going to thicken what you have in there. Acrylic paints are inherently fairly transparent, and so we get the base color, which is essentially a Mars black, showing through. Also, because, now we are going to get the question, this was initially a white canvas, but I did just paint black and let it fully dry, though you can buy pre-made or pre-black gesso canvases in a lot of art stores now, and that will work just as well. Let's move on to the next one. Now, throughout this lesson, as per usual, I'm going to try to show you the painting process from close up like this, so you can see the detail work and the brush strokes, but also quite a bit farther away, that way you can see how all of it works together and you have a better context for where things are on the canvas. But we will jump back and forth between those two throughout this. And this area right here is going to be a little bit larger than this one, so I'm going to take more steps to make it interesting and individual. You can see a greater number of openings, you'll see a greater number of gaps. The larger areas in the middle will also be more connected and thick, and overall we're just very quickly creating something that can hold more interest than that initially simplified piece towards the edge. And we're doing this again because it's a little bit bigger, so there's just more room to have detail, but also because as we move towards the center of the canvas, I want to incorporate more detail to bring the eye in there and keep the painting interesting. Also, as you move farther down, we're going to have areas that are a bit more spread out in light. So here it's almost little taps. I'm going to grab a bit more water just to make my application process easier. Again, condense those bristles. And you can see that very large gap. We can even incorporate a couple over here. And we're going to throw these throughout the painting. though this is almost its own step, which we will get to a little bit later. This is going to be built up through multiple layers, as acrylics typically are. And it'll just start to look better and better. But right now, we're putting in a fairly simple base. And this one's going to be a bit smaller, but it's going to be more interesting because down at the bottom, we'll have more going on. But we'll get there in just a minute. Right now, as you can see, I went back to my palette, grabbed some extra paint. Something you don't want to do is just kind of continuously apply water, because you'll eventually run out of pigment on your brush and you'll end up with something very thin that you'll have to go over numerous times. It can be very useful for implementing the initial strokes, just to solidify where you want things, almost like a rough sketch. But if you know where you want things, then you're going to want to go in with a little bit more paint, as you can see us doing right here. Though, again, we can start to move downwards. We'll have that kind of taper off. And then right through here, I can tell in the reference photo, there's a really interesting space where it kind of picks up again. There we go. You don't have to do this quickly. I'm doing so with a little bit of speed because A, you're watching the lesson and I want you to not have to sit and watch me paint horizontal lines for a dozen minutes, but also just because when you paint more quickly, you have less control, and often that can be really good in areas that you want to be semi-randomized because you don't kind of subconsciously instigate the same patterns and movements. Though if that is an issue, you can also jump to other areas in the painting, and that'll help you dramatically through that process. Now here, just going back up to the top, but let's take a step back just so we can continue implementing these with a greater context of where everything should be. Now, as you move over towards the right-hand side and continue this, we need to take more into account than the horizontal strokes, the irregular bumps in the road, and also consider all of the different areas that are kind of painted on and that have different directional pieces in the road, right? Here we have something very large, which we will look at in the reference photo shortly, but it is something to initially be avoided here. We will be painting on top of it to a point later on, but these two are going to stop relatively soon. See? Where those have the opportunity to really move down. That said, do a second little layer in the middle, trying to keep my hand and brush out of the way of the painting so you can still see accurately. There's another reflection coming right here, but it's significantly more subtle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some extra Mars Black, move that off to the side with the initial mixture, and create essentially just a darker gray than what we were previously working with. Grab some extra water, and we can brighten this up later should we want to, but very easy little extra application that we will get into later, because not all of this can be as bright as our initial applications. We're not just painting light here, though there is a lot of light and a lot of reflections of light, which I think is what makes the piece as a whole just so alluring. But with that, we're moving over here to the right-hand side. And something I'd like to note is that all of these aren't supposed to be the same size. The ones that we are about to work on are going to be a bit smaller. So my horizontal strokes are very minimal in terms of their length. I'm still using my pinky finger to ground my hand in general. And again, these are getting a bit of a shorter stopping point because of what will be on the road, but there are some areas where it essentially dodges those, and I'll paint those in here. And then we have another one over here. We'll also connect these to a gritter point a little bit later on in the painting, but right now we're just trying to get the proper spacing and line work in, and we can handle the rest of that a little bit later. But with that, there are also two smaller ones to the left. Something else I want you to notice is that while the widths are different, in large part so are the lengths. So still aiming for quite a bit of diversity in here. We'll have a couple over here, just trying to find where my actual lights are, as they will have a very large impact on these reflections, right? That's how these reflections are being generated. It's the lights above. So we want to make sure that they are under our drawings of the lights, though we could move the drawings of the lights. It's just a little bit easier to go at it in the way that we have been, but there we go. Much more subtle. Much more subtle. Now, as you move even farther back, we can continue to take those greater highlights and just tap on little areas that are going to be receiving that extra bit of shine. And these are going to be scattered throughout. And this essentially just notes that the entirety of the road is wet to a point. I'm not going to do too many of them, but we want to do enough to establish the fact that the road is a lot more than just this area. It'll take out a lot of negative space. It'll introduce a pattern that is more than just the horizontal strokes. I'm avoiding this larger area as a whole, just because we are going to still paint that in soon. But these taps are going to be smaller as you move up, and they're going to be larger and can even be clustered here as you move into the foreground. Just because of perspective, they'll look smaller from a distance. So here I'll expand some of them, but we don't want too many. So for now, I'm happy with that. Next, while we will be returning to these, we are going to switch our brush. Next, we'll grab a 1-inch flat-headed brush because it's great for blocking in larger areas and has a nice sharp edge, which is fantastic in these street scenes. But I will make sure it's damp, and then we'll look over here at the reference photo, and you can see what we need to incorporate next. It's large, it's more of a mid to dark gray, and we'll actually do our test of value directly on it so we ensure that we end up with something that's not too bright or dark. Now, I'm going to begin with quite a bit of my titanium white, and then I'll go with about 2/10 that Mars black. So not too much. And we'll slowly interject that darker pigment in, just to ensure that we don't overdo it. Here you can see it's still far too bright, so we'll go in with maybe another 2/10. Mix that up, and when I mix it, I like to ensure that it's fully mixed so that I don't have some areas that are a bit more white, a bit more black. This way we have something that's nice and consistent. We go over for the test, and yet again, still far too bright. So let's add another 2/10. At this point, we're at about 6:4 in terms of Mars black to titanium white. Go in for that application, and we're definitely getting closer, but it still needs to be a little bit darker. So we just slowly work that in, slowly build a larger sample size to eventually work with. And that right there looks very, very close. Let's grab slightly more Mars black, do a test. Perfect. Now let's head over to our canvas. Now, this application here will be quite a cathartic process as we get to layer on a lot of paint and do so in a very relaxed manner. We don't have to worry too much about dry time because if we end up getting a rough look in the end, it'll actually look great because it is a road. Though we do want to manage our edges first, because when you have a damp brush and newly wet paint, it's easiest to incorporate sharp lines. So here, that's what we're doing. And then once we've essentially incorporated the necessary lines, then we can move in. And I'm going to work in this bottom area, essentially on the same line that we've created there, leaving occasionally little portions unfinished. So we'll have darker areas, we'll have a little bit of that black of the grit of the canvas showing through, and it's just going to give us some very free texture. Then I'll make my brush damp, we'll grab more pigment, head back up to the top, and much like we worked over through that line in our stroke here, this time we're going to be following these strokes. And much like the last application, I'm going to leave portions of this rough showing through, as that texture really will be nice. Not putting it everywhere, and I am to a point leaving a little bit of a dividing line down here. I don't want it to be as obvious as it currently is, but it is something that I am keeping in. And the more you go over it, the more you will eliminate that textured look, being able to see the original color showing through. Here I'm working with a bit more of a soft application, as to not add brush stroke, but to just spread out paint a little bit. And this is done just to make things that look a little bit more subtle than they were, because they were quite dramatic. There we go. We have another one of these right up here. Again, using my pinky finger to ground my hand in an area that is dry. Doing our edges first. There we go. And then we just follow that edge. Nice and easy. Grab a bit more. And we don't have to go over this all again, but it is an option. It's all up to you on how much texture you want. Now, I waited for all of that to dry completely and just sketched in where some of our additional reflections are. So going back to the damp liner brush, I'll grab the original lighter mixture that we have here on our palette, and I'll go in and work that through. Now, it's not going to be a straight line through all of it. We need to remember that this, as well as the road, has little bumps and divots, areas that are risen and bit more shallow. Now, this reflection isn't actually this one. This is coming from a light that's attached to a building. This is going to be from the actual street light, so much larger. We'll expand on it to a greater degree. We still want the edges to taper into something sharp. We want the middle portion to be a bit more thick, and then we can have these areas that kind of come out and create that nice little sprinkle of color eventually. We'll go back into the middle, make sure it's nice and thick. Then this actually does continue, but I'm not going to get the edge because that protrudes a little bit. And we're not going to do too much of this, but it'll work nice beside it. It's a good look. Now this one also continues. Again, I'm not getting the absolute lip of what we have here. We'll have it space itself out towards the bottom. Go back, grab some extra paint. You can tell that this is a lot more watery than that because it's just significantly more semi-transparent. So we'll just go over that again, predominantly in the middle. If you can have the middle be much more opaque than the edges, it can actually produce a really nice look, and we'll incorporate that purposefully in a later step of the painting. But if you can start incorporating it now, it's great. And we just easily do that by going back in, doing more thick layers in the middle, and leaving the edges to be a bit more thin, maybe a bit more watery. Here I'll also tap in just a couple little highlights. Nothing really substantial. Though the edges can also receive a nice highlight, though we want to go back to the 1 inch for that. Now we'll take the damp 1 inch flat-headed brush. We'll remix essentially what we have here, but we'll make it just a hint brighter. We don't want it to be as bright as that, but we don't want it to be as dark as that. So something more so in the middle. And again, you can just print off the reference photo and test it directly on that. I actually have mine taped above my palette and above my painting, so I'll just do a little test. That looks great. I think we just make it a little bit brighter, like that. And now, the highlight is going to catch the protruding area, and it's going to be brighter up here, so we'll go over that again with a brighter mix, but as we get down towards the bottom, this will be perfect. We don't want it to go all the way down. We'll also throw this over here, not to a significant degree, but enough. And there as well. Now we have a bit of this over on the corner. So I'm just going to use the corner of this brush to do some sharp mark making. And now we'll build it up. Doubling my titanium white. Still not as bright as what we have there. Do a little test. Could be brighter, but we will build with it. Not sure if you can see, but I still do have my pinky finger on the canvas. There we go. And we can do a little tap down here. Yet again, more titanium white, and this one should be almost as bright as our reflective highlights. Now as you build over wet paint, we're not going to get the same pigment that we have directly on our palette because it's going to be blending with that darker mixture that's still on the actual canvas. So you may need to build it up a couple of times, but this is essentially how we get there the proper way. Or at least a way that affords us a lot of safety and room to check and play. There we are. Really love this. It's a little technique, but I think it adds a lot dimensionally. Now, while we re-examine the reference photo up here towards the top of all of these reflections, you'll see a not so opaque layer of reflective highlight that works its way down this way and dissipates in the process. It's very prevalent right here, and you can still see there's a bit of a horizontal movement to a lot of this, but it does dissipate and it's almost entirely lost when we hit this line, which connects to this larger piece which we just painted. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix that pigment and we're going to make it relatively watery. Now, we'll do that right off to the side here. I'll start with about half and half Mars Black and Titanium White. Get a good mix again. We don't want some areas to be more white and some to be more black. We want it to be properly blended. Go in, and far too dark. We'll grab about double our titanium white, work that in. You can see that I'm flipping my brush over in the mixing process. That way I don't have the top of the brush or the bottom with an entirely different value or pigment. And that right there looks pretty perfect. Though this needs to be quite a bit more watery to make it semi-transparent and not work over our previous pigment in an unaesthetic way. So now I'm just dipping my brush in some extra water, wiping off the excess, but it is significantly more wet. We'll grab some of this pigment, work it off on another area of the palette, grab a bit more water, and you can see now it's kind of separating on the actual palette. It's a bit more like watercolor, which is great for what we want to do next. Now I'm going to take my pinky finger, ground my hand, go up to the top of our essentially a horizon here with the road. Connect all of these reflections. Just like this. You can also use a ruler if you want it to be perfectly straight. But we're going to have a lot of orb-like lights that are going to distort it anyway. Then, from that top, as I move towards the middle, I'm going to expand downwards a little bit, just like so. And again, there is a hard cutoff right where we meet these. That said, I don't really want much more paint in that area, so I'm going to take my brush, take off all of that existing paint, make the brush just barely damp, but it doesn't need much water because there's still quite a bit on here. And then we can blend this out very softly, eliminating some of those harder lines, and now we have something that looks significantly better. We can go back and we can touch up definitive areas, like what I wanted to here. Very simply. We can even use this down here. This is something that I think I'm going to want to brighten up to a point as we continue the painting process, just because I noticed it's quite bright in the reference photo. But we can also head to the top. It's also worth noting that this is something you only really want to do when these are entirely dry, because when we're working with this much water, it's easy to rip not fully dry pigment off the canvas. Once it is dry, it's no worries at all, but we do want to make sure that it is nice and safe. That said, I'm just doing a little bit more definitive line work, not much. This will really look best when it's a bit more ambiguous. And we can use our finger, but again, when you use your finger, make sure that it's perfectly clean, because you want the oils from your hands getting on there and making an area difficult to work with, as the oils can make it so that the water and the paint don't necessarily adhere to the canvas. So, with that, step is good, and let's start working on the next one. Now we're going to switch to a stiff bristled fan brush. As you can tell, all of these are very rough. They're fairly hard. When we go in with the tapping motion, we can render markings smaller than what we could with our liner brush, and it's great for little textures in our road, though it is stiff. And I mentioned that a couple of times because you can also get a medium or a soft bristled fan brush like this, and this one's damp. You can tell that all of the bristles have condensed. This is great for something like foliage, but not our next step. So I would recommend something that has a bit of a harder bristle. I'm not going to get this wet because I do want to maintain the separation that we have, and this is synthetic. all of my brushes are, and it is what I prefer to work with. Now, we don't actually do our mixing with that brush, as the paint, like water, can condense bristles. So we'll go back in with the 1-inch, just because it's great for moving around a lot of paint. And we're going to remix essentially the highlight that we have, or just something a little bit darker. I still have that right here on my palette. Everything else is dry, so I don't have to worry about diluting it. But we'll start with that titanium white. I believe our initial mixture was 1/10 Mars Black, so I'll just take off the excess, work that inside, and we have something a little bit brighter than what we want, so we'll grab a bit more Mars Black. Again, we're opting for slightly darker over slightly lighter. And this is just going to be for some nice subtle details. We'll clean off that 1-inch, that way we don't have paint drying on it. Put that down, grab our fan brush, get that on both sides. And then in areas where we have larger clusters, we can just do some nice little taps. This texture is especially great in the foreground because we're not really going to see this amount of detail in the background to a great degree. The eye is just not going to be able to pick that up. And as you can tell, it's not really dramatic. We can have it slowly dissipate and become more randomized as we move towards the back here. But it's a little detail that's going to go a long way when we start incorporating colors. When we start glazing on all of the hue, that's when this is really going to matter. But right now, we're just getting this on here. We're taking our time. You can tell that for the most part, my brush is remaining horizontal. And that's because I do want predominantly horizontal patterns. However, occasionally I will rotate the brush, but that's more so when I'm just using the corner or an edge. I don't actually want diagonal markings. Barely noticeable because we did make it darker and we're not using a lot of paint, but it definitely will help in a little bit. There we go. Now what we're going to do is take our liner brush, a good amount of our titanium white, and barely a hint of Mars Black. Before we were going for about 1/10. This time it is less. We are looking for a mixture that is brighter than what we previously used for our highlights. So I'm just mixing up a good amount of that. We'll make our brush nice and damp, as we do, for easier application. And the camera is very far back right now intentionally, because I want you to see this from farther away rather than up close. Our technique is essentially the same as what it's been in the reflections, in that we're working horizontally, back and forth, looking for a tapered edge with a more full body. And I'm just going in between all of my previous applications, or rather on top, but in the middle of all of our previous reflective applications. And I'm just adding some extra light inside. This is going to build a little bit of depth, make it look like towards the edges it dissipates to a greater degree. We were already trying to do that, but this is going to help us with that general effect. And we'll need to go over this a number of times as we are working with a decent amount of water. But again, I wanted to show it to you from a bit farther away so you could see essentially just how it all varies in brightness, and the fact that it's going to look a whole lot better as we kind of conclude this process. But we do still have quite a bit to do in this process. So what I'm going to do is now get you closer, and you can watch how we do the detail portion of it up close. So yet again, damp brush, minute amount of pigment, grounding our hand with our pinky finger, and finding those previous strokes, working in the middle of them, working towards the edges, but not covering up the entirety of that last application, leaving the edges to be a bit of that slightly darker gray. It's still relatively a lighter gray, but in comparison to what we're applying now, it is darker. So we're trying to keep all of these different values. That way it remains as three-dimensional as we can get it. This liner brush is also a little bit smaller than the one I worked with previously, just to make the process of working inside our previous markings easier. But the application style is still the same. Something else we can do is take this and then continue to highlight areas that we wanted to previously, but struggled with due to our brushes just being too big in that area. So one was right there. Also wanted a bit more along this edge, and I wanted it a bit more on the top here. But I want that to blend down, so I'm just going to grab some extra water with my brush and work that like this. Just using the water to blend it. We're doing a wet onto dry blend right now. Just meaning that we're taking wet pigment and we're blending it on top of dry. Very self-explanatory, but I think with a lot of paint, we're used to working wet onto wet, so mixing wet paint into wet paint. Here, we're just letting the water essentially do a lot of that visual blend. And you can also have like little areas that work out to the left and right from these larger reflections. You can add a lot of life to this really quickly and easily at this stage. But we wanted to do that essentially wash of highlight before we got to any of this, and we needed that base built first. We will expand to the other sides, but so that we ensure that everything's cohesive, we're going to take the camera a little bit farther back again. Something else I'd like to note that I'm going to purposefully do is not add too much light to the left and right hand side. So I'll probably be using a bit less as I get this way and that way, simply because I want to draw the eye towards the middle of the painting, and as we know, the eye goes to the brightest portion of any piece. So if we can keep that very centralized, we can ensure that the eye doesn't want to stray off of our canvas and into another area of the room. Just little subconscious tricks we can work into our artwork. We can also darken this by just adding a little bit more Mars Black. Alternatively, we can just add a bit more water so it's more semi-transparent, so you can see the darker pigments show through it to a greater degree. And that's essentially what I'm doing right now. So I just have a bit more water on my brush. As this dries, it'll look a bit darker. This is nice though. I do want to build this up a bit more. It's still centralized enough, and it kind of acts as a balance so that the painting doesn't feel too heavy on one side. Different things to consider. We can add little taps throughout. Again, not doing too many, but here and there can be really nice. And then my brush is very watery. It's not doing much at all to the edges, but it is there. We'll stretch out that brighter highlight. And now we can work on the next step. Now, while I think a lot of us are probably pretty inspired to start working on the actual lights, what we really need to do is start on the buildings that we have to the left and to the right, because all of these lights that we'll be painting overlap them to a point. So we need to start with them, and then we can make our painting very pretty. But let's begin there. For said process, we'll be working with a smaller flat-headed brush. This one's about 1/3 of an inch wide, and this will be great because it dimensionally just fits the shape of the sides of our buildings or windows. This sharp edge will be fantastic for cutting in. It has nice sharp corners for really detailed areas, and it'll just be very versatile for those distant buildings. So we'll begin by making sure that our smaller brush is nice and damp. Those bristles are condensed, and I'll be beginning on the left-hand side of this building in particular. Now, there's a common rule that we need to establish before we start painting these, and while the individual lights are going to have an impact on the buildings and where that light is, in general, the majority of the light is coming from the street. So the sides of the buildings that are directly facing the street, the essentially right-hand side of the buildings on the left-hand side of the canvas, and the left-hand side of the buildings that are on the right-hand side of the canvas are going to be brighter. With the areas that are directly facing us, they're going to be a bit darker because there just isn't as much a light in general on them. Now, this rule will change depending upon where these lights actually are, but it's a good starting area, and we always do want to consider where our primary light sources are. In this, it's more of a accumulation of light rather than when we're painting something like a forest and we have a bright sun, right? So just different things we need to establish before we actually jump in. But let's start with this brighter wall right here. Now, it isn't going to be quite as bright as the lights that we have down here, more of a mid value, probably closer to this. So let's start by grabbing some of our titanium white, move it to a clean spot on our palette. We'll grab about maybe 1/5 that Mars black, and this will probably be too bright, but again, it's easier to darken pigments than it is to lighten them, so I like to begin this way, and then we will just progressively make it a little bit darker, double up that Mars black. We can test it on our canvas. We can also test it on the reference photo, and when we have something we like, we'll make our brush nice and damp yet again. Head over to this side, and we'll just paint in initially the edges. And remember why we do the edges first? It's because when we have fresh paint and water on our brush, it's easier to paint in sharp markings. And as we continue to paint and that paint runs out, it gets harder and harder. So we work on the areas that'll be the most difficult to begin with first. I'm going to apply slightly more pressure towards the bottom so that it's a little bit brighter as we're closer to a lot of these lights in general. There we go. And then we can fill in these areas. Then we can go back and establish the windows and other little ornate details. Also, as I move up, I'm going to make my brush significantly more wet. You can also make your mixture a little bit darker because I want this to essentially blend up into the darker top and get lost in the lack of light that there is. So we just want something that gets much more subtle. You can grab a lot of Mars black and just kind of have these two mixes on hand. There we go. Nice and easy. Now we can get some details. We'll make it a mix of that half Mars black, half mixer that we had. And we'll cut in for some details. There we go. We also have a window area right here, and that's going to be quite dark. So let's just establish the area around it. Get some extra Mars black. Again, the traceable will be up over on Patreon. We can also find the material list, reference photo, all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. We also have an exclusive Facebook group you can get access to up there where everybody shares their artwork. See a lot of different renditions of the lessons we do on the channel. So you get to see different ideas. It's a very, very supportive group, which I like a lot. Very positive, very encouraging. Actually very, very proud of everybody up there. If you are part of that, thank you for making that as great as you do. But that is a resource that is available if you want to get this exactly like mine. So now we have that area for the window. I'm going to create little spots in between. It's on an angle. Just catching a little bit of light. We don't need it to go all the way down, just the implication of it. We can have some extra highlights on the top there. Essentially all of the ledges that will be on a building are going to have a little bit of rain falling on them as long as they protrude, and that'll highlight them to a point. Now as you move to this side of the building, things are going to get a little bit darker because we're not facing that, right? And I don't have to establish as many edges, so I can work more so in the body. Running out of paint, so I'm just going to let that happen as I move my way upwards. I do want some darker inner spaces, and we have these highlighted edges because the water's coming down and the water is really catching that light, but there are also these inset areas, right? And there are bottoms to it, and that's what we need to paint with the darker mixtures. So I'm following the edge of this here, and this one's going to be more straight, where that one leans in and down. And I'm kind of just always going back and forth between these. As it's that constant iteration that's going to get us to what we really want it to be. Now I'm taking artistic liberties from the actual reference photo simply because we only have so much physical space to work with here. If we were working on a much larger, say 24 by 36 inch canvas, then we could get every detail in there, but we are limited by the actual space that we have. So I'm taking liberties to make it look as good as it can, and sometimes I think even better. Artistic liberties are one of those things where we step out of our comfort zone, we step out of the reference photo, we take our own ideas and we work them in. I'm a big believer in that. I have a lot of fun with it. Do that with just about all of the lessons, but I essentially like to think of the reference photos as guides, ways for me to see things that I wouldn't innately think to interject. And then once I have those in there and I have all of those neat new details that I wouldn't think of, then I like to incorporate my own once I have that foundation. So it's kind of a combination of the two, and I think it keeps paintings really interesting. I'm not just copying a photograph, I'm making it my own, but I'm also using that photograph to make it much more than it would have been otherwise. With that, as we get down here, I think what I want to do, I'm just looking at the photo, is make this base a bit darker. This is just the underside of this building. This will be essentially a couple of just focusing on the details here. This will be a couple of pillars when we're done. These lines can be a lot straighter. One of those things where if I put my hand there, I'm completely blocking the camera, so I think I'll have to move the camera to get that just the way I want it to be. But we're going to put in some pillars, open up this space. I think it'll be a really nice look. We can put some lights on these pillars after. You can see that we have some reflections there for them. And this bottom area is brighter, so you can see that I'm now applying with a brighter pigment. But we don't want to go too high with it. And in the process, we made this one a lot larger unintentionally. So I'll just go back and make that a bit smaller. That essentially happened because I pressed too hard with my brush, and when you press too hard with your brush, your bristles expand. So when you want very detailed, delicate areas, the best way of going about it is to go in with a very minimal amount of pressure. Now inside this, we're going to have some extra highlight because much like this wall, it is facing the actual street. Might be a little bit too much, so we'll just darken it a hint. Again, you can test directly on the reference photo. And I will link the reference photo in the video description as well, just as is. There we go. And then we can do some ambiguous markings in this rainy background. And this is markings that necessarily don't have specific form because it's just too far away to tell what we're actually looking at. I always enjoy that. A little bit of mystery. Let's take a bit of a step back, look at it, and then jump back in. Now, stepping back, we can see that this, in comparison to everything else, really is quite dark. But that's good, and that's what we want, because we want our center of attention to be there, and this is essentially something to accent the rest of this and give it more realism, because that's going to be a lot of abstract shapes, essentially, in light. So with that, as we continue to move towards the right-hand side and work on this building, this one's a bit farther back than this, so we're going to incorporate less detail, but we're going to continue working with the same general ideas, and that the surface that is facing the road is going to be lighter. So we'll grab some titanium white, some Mars black, about an equal amount to what we used for the bright side of this one. We'll go in with a little test. That's definitely too bright. And when I do go and I apply these extra little markings to previously applied areas, sometimes you go over them again and you just kind of adjust that color. Sometimes you keep it because it's just nice and a little painterly. Something, again, I do appreciate in my paintings. Okay, so we have a pigment that I think works really well. We'll start, of course, as you know, on our edges, applying slightly more pressure towards the bottom to fill out our application, make something a bit brighter just because it has more thick paint, and then as you move towards the top, we will be softer and just let it essentially fade off. We can also do some finger painting should we want to, and we'll fill in this area as well. Nice and easy to begin with, though we will add some interesting pieces to it. Let's get something a little bit darker. We'll have perhaps an under portion, and again I'm taking some artistic liberties here, but the traceable will be created to match the actual painting so that you can follow along with exactly what I'm doing. Creating a darker area underneath so that it looks like it's inset a little bit, though a lot of this is going to be covered up with light anyway. And I'll get you a little bit closer because we are working on some details now. So here we are. Now again, going in with a slightly darker mixture than what we were previously working with, following these same general trajectories. We can incorporate more little ledges, with something I personally love incorporating in buildings when I'm taking liberties, just because it's intuitive, it's adding structure, detail without being overly complicated. We have multiple dimensions with it, and that we have that under area. And then we can have one on top that catches more light. And as I do this, you'll notice that I'm not doing an elongated stroke. I'm doing little taps that accumulate together, and that way I have some areas that are just a little bit brighter than others, and it makes for a more interesting piece. Again, in the reference photo, can't really see detail in this. I'm going to add a couple darker inset windows. Trying to find a position with my hand that doesn't also block the camera. We'll grab some extra Mars Black. You can see it's starting to dry. Often I get asked how I keep my pigment wet on the canvas for the entirety of the painting process, and the answer is I do not. I regularly just grab extra paint off camera. There we go. We have 3 elongated windows, so a different window system to what we have here. Always trying to look for ways to diversify. I think that could be a bit darker though. Start off with something a bit more subtle for the test, and then we build on it. We can also use the liner brush for getting our corners sharp if we want to, but again, it is a bit farther away, so I don't think it's entirely necessary. And then again, I'm going to head down to the bottom and just further layer this. There we are. Nice and easy. Now, as we get farther back, we'll make it a little bit darker, the area that faces the street. Do a test in here. Definitely too bright. Mix it with some of the pre-established dark pigment. Again, this is something we can test on the reference photo. Even if we're not following the details, the lighting scheme will work. The values, essentially, that we're working with. Here we go. I think it could actually be slightly darker. It's also worth noting that we are working with acrylics which do dry slightly darker than when they are applied. But that should do. And you'll notice that we go farther up as we move towards the left, and as we go this way, it ends significantly shorter, just because we're not going to see all of that, as there isn't the same amount of light and our eyes just can't catch on to it as it's farther in the distance. But that is a really good background that we can incorporate lights to, but before we do, I want to head over to this side and get these done as well so we can handle all of the lights and things like the street lights at once. Now, on the right-hand side, I'm going to begin with the brightest area of actual space, and we would assume that it's essentially the surfaces that are facing the street, and for the most part that's correct. However, the underside of this building that kind of protrudes outwards is going to catch more light simply because it's going to have lights in it, smaller ones that essentially illuminate it, and a bunch of ones surrounding it which also come up, and it essentially traps that light. So we'll work on this first, still using that 1/3 inch flat-headed brush. We'll grab some titanium white, about an equal mixture of our Mars Black here. Mix that up nice and thoroughly. Grab some extra water. And I'm going to do a test on my reference photo, so just give me a second here. Should be slightly brighter. You will notice that I also have new Mars Black on the palette, helping us along the way. And now I'm going to craft my edges. And we have a myriad of beams throughout this, holding up this space, but I'm actually going to paint over all of them just to establish the area first. There we go. Now we'll fill that in. If you find that it's a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark, that's okay. We can always go over it with a new layer. What we're really trying to do is get some sharp lines edging just through here, through the bottom. Get a relatively thick application. Here you can see I'm leaving this area a little bit rough because I know I'm going to want to put that in. And I'll allow it to get a little bit darker as we move towards the left, or rather towards the right, simply because we want a bit of extra vignette effect towards the edge. So I'll grab some Mars Black. And I know it's looking really messy. That is just part of acrylic painting sometimes. Don't worry, we will make this look a whole lot more aesthetic as we proceed. Right now though, we'll just do this very simple wet into wet blend. Have it get progressively lighter as we move towards the center. And this can be explained with there just being more lights in this area. But realistically, it's a bit of an artistic liberty to aid the piece in general. So, not too complicated. Again, a little messy, but that's all right. We'll have it looking well very soon. Now, I want some posts in here. And we'll go with a mid-gray. We're going to highlight some edges of them, darken some, but we want a good base. So I want something that's not bright and not dark. Very much middle of the road. And I'm looking at these reflections because they are a good indicator of where these are going to be, because there are going to be lights on this that cause reflections in the road. There we go. And again, taking a second, just looking up at my photo. We have another one over here. We have another one over here. Slowly just accumulating. The ones that are closest to us can be a little bit larger just because of perspective, so these ones, where these two can be a little bit smaller. And then as you move towards this way, there's one that kind of sits in the back, so it doesn't go all the way up to the top, but we'll establish that a little bit later. It can be smaller. It doesn't have to be, just because it is a little bit farther away, but it's not dramatically far away. And we can have another one right here. So, now, let's grab some Mars Black. About double what we had in our previous mixture, so it's not a truly dark mix, but it's also not bright. And I'm going to do something a little bit interesting here. The area that's facing us is going to be the darkest, with the right-hand side of the pillar and the left-hand side being a little bit brighter. So I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to blend just a little bit to the other sides. Now, because we're using a medium-sized brush, essentially, this isn't going to be the easiest process, and we will have to go back over it with something a bit more detailed later. But we're just establishing where things go, and this is also how we can show that this doesn't go all the way to the top, much like the rest of these. And we essentially have the area facing the street now a little bit brighter, and the area that's facing inwards because of the lights that exist within that space. Now I want a brighter mix than what we've been working with. And we'll use this for the area that faces the road. And we want it to be a little bit brighter because it needs to be brighter than what we have here so that it actually stands out to a point. Not dramatically, but a little bit. And this is something you can build up. It doesn't have to be substantially brighter on the first application. There we go. Can add a little bit on the back. Just build up that dimension. And then we can go for more of a mid-gray for the areas that are inside, but something that definitely is darker than what we have on the top here and on the edges. And this can be a bit more ambiguous. We're essentially just filling in space with somewhat abstract applications. Again, there is more information visually in the reference photo, but we only have so much space to work with, and I don't want to overcomplicate it. It's important to recognize that simplicity in painting can often have a really healthy effect on it, make it look a whole lot better. I think when a lot of us start working on drawings and paintings, we have this need to overcomplicate everything, and as a result it can actually really hinder our work. And as we kind of mature in it, we recognize that having some areas more simple can make other areas look a lot better simply by contrast, and draw the eye in. Again, we want the eye here. If we make this too complicated, the eye is going to go here, it's going to stay here. We don't want that. So, I think that's a good start. Again, we're going to have quite a few lights in here, and for now I'm happy with that. Let's start moving up. This is facing the street. In the reference photo, it's actually quite dark, assumably because of the material that it's made of just not being that reflective, which is also something we need to take into consideration. But, again, artistic liberties, I'm going to make it brighter just because it follows suit with the general rules of our painting, so we're just going to assume it's made of something a bit more reflective. And I'll go into something that's brighter than what we have underneath by just a little bit, but not a great amount. We can darken it later if we need to as well, so I'm not too concerned. There we go. Now we'll go for more of a mid-gray for the area that goes there. We can have that over here and over here, as they essentially are going to have the same light on them. And then that bright pigment can be used here. And admittedly, this is probably too bright. This is where we would like to test on our reference photo, but because we're changing the color, we can't really. So I'm just going to make it a bit darker, but lighter than what we have to the sides, right? It's all about balance. And this is why working in a black and white palette makes this so much easier, because if we were also balancing hues in this, it would be quite an experience. So with that, as I've been working, I've been thinking, you know what? I want the edges of these to be just a little bit brighter. It can't be much brighter because we don't want to take away from the lights that we'll be incorporating, but we can do a little bit more. There we go. Again, it's all about recognizing balance, right? Now, as we move upwards, we're going to, like we did over here, get darker. Now, this is a bit more inset, just by a little bit. So Let's go for a gray that's similar to this, but a little bit darker. We'll do a little test. That's actually perfect. And again, we start with the bottom, the edges, we work our way up. I want that to get darker more quickly than it is. I'm just not running out of paint quickly enough. So we'll grab some Mars Black, go up to the top, work our way down. There we go. We'll get a mix of the two for the side and for here. We do have a little street light overlapping quite a bit of it though. And then to the right hand side we'll go even darker, as it doesn't really have any light in that area. And then we have another protruding spot over here. I know we've been doing this at this distance in this area for quite some time, but we are just at one of those heavy focus points where we do a lot in a small space. And then I think I just want another little line there. We can incorporate a small ledge using this. And I think we want a window. Big fan of the windows. Especially the subtle ones. There we go. Here we are, a little bit closer. I wanted to show you that these areas aren't actually perfect. I'm sure you could tell that before, but often getting really close up to a painting, you can see the brush strokes, how things aren't always perfectly straight, and I wanted to bring you closer for that to show you. That way when you're working on it and you're probably fighting to get perfection, you see that we don't need it. And there is rain falling, there are visual obstructions, it's okay. I'm also highlighting this building, this edge of it just a little bit. And we can make these windows a bit more interesting. Again, lots of little finger painting, imperfect, but I think very pretty. We can use this to almost outline the edge a little bit. Don't like to outline things in painting. You like to show the variance of subject through a change in value, but through a little blend like that, it's easily fixed. I'm really struggling to get this line straight, just with the camera where it is, so I'm going to leave that and fix it when I move the camera. We can do little touch-ups like this, and towards the middle here I want something that's a little bit darker than that, but this is the highlight for this building. So let's go in with this. Let's go to here. Let's wrap this down. There we are. A little bit of a blend into this, but we can fill that with lights. And then we can have another ambiguous area right there. Having a lot of fun with this. There we go. We also have lights, which we actually can fill in with this brush right now and this mid-gray. We can brighten them later if we want, but this brush is a great size to just get these in. This building is essentially just a little bit too far away for us to actually see it or the details. Here I'm just using Mars Black to cut in around the edges, give them better form. You can also use your liner brush to kind of correct these sorts of things. But this is a very easy way of going about it. From there, we can start working on the street lights and the actual lights throughout it. So, very fun step yet to come. We'll start with street light number 1 on the left-hand side here and our liner brush. I'm going to go for a mid-gray, so something similar to what we have right here on the palette, really nothing too bright or dark. I essentially don't want it to get lost in the grays here, so it needs to be a little bit brighter than that, but it also needs room to get brighter because different portions of it are going to be highlighted. And this first layer is going to look quite two-dimensional, but it's through the additional layers that we can make it look like it fits and has its own elements of realism. Now, typically, I like to make my strokes in partial connected applications, but here we do have some softer lines like that, and those I will do with one individual elongated stroke. We also have one down here. And my general rule is that if a line is to look organic or sharp, I'll make it with multiple applications, but if it's to be curved and smooth, I'll try to make it with one. Which is why with trees and branches, typically you'll see lots of little connected strokes, and with these, it's singular strokes. Different strokes will kind of create different types of larger effects. This was done through multiple strokes, not because I wanted it to have a varied or textured look, but just because getting an elongated stroke that large without it having a curve to it is rather difficult. So we opted for that in that very specific scenario. With that, we will add extra highlights to this, and we'll do that by just grabbing some extra titanium white. And this is where we add dimension to it. And we know that we're going to have light around here. And that light is going to stretch on the inside. Oh, I'm not sure if you get to hear that. That was my stomach saying, "Hi, you've been painting for a while. Can you feed me?" And my answer to it right now is going to be no. However, friendly reminder to all of you, if you've been painting for a while, it is good to ensure that you are staying hydrated, that you are having snacks here or there, because often we get a little shaky when we don't eat. And we don't want that. There's going to be a light coming from this, so I'm going to highlight the pole right there, nice and close to it. Now, at this point, this is standing out to a rather great degree because there isn't anything as bright in its general vicinity. That's okay. Once we add the lights, this will kind of sink into the background. But while we're here, I also want to paint in a couple of little pieces. We're going to get, again, a mid-gray, a little bit darker than what we have here. We are going to have the reflection from this right down at the bottom. Already have that implemented. We're just looking for a nice clean rectangle. I work my edges first, as you know. This is also easily achieved with the 1/3 inch flat-headed brush. But I have this one out, and I'm confident in my abilities to create a nice, sharp, even rectangle, which will be visually distorted relatively soon with the actual lights, but that's okay. It's on a little bit of an angle, just give it some character. Don't have to do that, but it is an option. And then I know I want another one right over here. Partially overlapping this building and the opening as well. There we go. Now we need some Mars black, a little bit of that gray. There we go. And then we can have our lights incorporated as well. But we'll wait to do the lights all at once. Let's sew it over to the right hand side. Now this one is slightly farther away, just minorly, but because of that I think we're going to make it a little bit darker. Now the other one was relatively bright, so it's not hard to make it darker. Again, for the top of it, what are we going to do? We're going to go for one continuous stroke, or at least attempt to. There we go. Have to do a little fix, unfortunately, go over it a couple times, but I think that still worked out quite well. Go back to our palette. Again, one stroke there. Going to have to make a couple to get all the way to the bottom. This one isn't going as smoothly as the other, but we can always refine edges if we want to. You know what, I can tell that I actually want this to be a bit darker. But we can always refine edges by remixing the pigments that are on the left and right hand side and just covering it up. There we go. Let's grab some pure Mars black. And this is essentially how we can do that, but I do want to cover it because I just want to make it darker. The top is fine because it's so close to the light. Now going over the Mars black is going to really darken what I'm applying right here, but it ended up working out quite nicely. I'll also incorporate that. I know I'm a bit more quiet right now than I have been for the rest of the lesson, but that's just because it's one of those areas that requires quite a lot of concentration. And typically, another little thing that I do to get clean strokes is I hold my breath a little bit while I work on sharp edges. Not to any great extent. And if you have trouble with breathing, then I would not recommend it. But it is something I occasionally do just to steady myself. You can see this really isn't dramatically different value-wise from what we've previously worked with. There we are. Nice and easy. Also create a bit more of a highlight for where the light's going to be shining. But we'll be reasonable with it. Now we do have a couple more of these, as you can see, kind of working their way into the distance. We're going to make these a bit darker than what we have on these sides. And we can do that easily because we have such a dark backdrop. Now I'm going to apply as little pressure as I can, and I don't have much pigment on my brush. All of that's intentionally done because we want our markings to get smaller and smaller as we move into the distance, because perspective is going to make them smaller. So, there we go. There we go. There we go. Now we'll make it a little bit darker. Just like that. Taking the excess paint off my brush, making it damp yet again. This will be covered up by a lot of lights for the most part, but it's good to have it. That way if we don't cover up any area, we don't have to incorporate it later. There we are. Now we get to work on something very fun. Now we'll take a couple of steps back, take our liner brush, and begin incorporating some lights. Now we're going to be layering these over just about everything. They are going to be essentially as bright, if not a little bit brighter, as the highlights that we have in here. I'm going to start with singular, almost dot-like applications, and then we go for the blends. I'll get you closer, but I just want to note where each of the lights is going to be in this so that we can kind of articulate initial balance, and then we can go in with the blending and whatnot. So we'll make our liner brush nice and damp, just dipping that in a little water, wiping off the excess, grabbing an abundance of titanium white, moving that to a clean spot on our palette. We'll grab the smallest amount of Mars Black, again, even less than 1/10, but just a little bit to dilute it. That way, if we want to make a singular area brighter, we can. We still have that room to move up in brightness. That's essentially why we're doing it. But now I took the majority of that paint off my brush. We'll grab just a hint on the end there. And I'm going to start very simply by creating a line of street lights. They're going to get larger every time we move up, and the separation, as you can see, gets longer every time as well. Now up here, we can paint it in the traditional shape of the street light, though the glow that we apply to it after will dramatically change the actual shape. So we'll just work that on. You can see it's very rounded. It's about half of a globe with no hard edges. I know you are quite far away. Again, intentional at this point, just so you have a sense of where everything is. Though you can also, again, just use the traceable in the reference photo. Should make it nice and easy. There we go. Fun fact, this is the second time I'm recording and teaching this lesson. The first time I did it, I started with the lights because I think for myself and a lot of us, that's the most interesting, fun portion of this. But it just didn't work layering wise. So I ended up essentially just redoing the lesson. Sometimes the paintings turn out really nice, but I feel like if it can be taught better, it should probably just be redone, right? So, welcome to our second iteration. I think it's going even better than the first, which is really nice. Kind of was able to use that as a practice round, almost. We'll incorporate the lights in our signs, jumping around, slowly filling out the painting, making it more lively, but there's still quite a lot to do. So we'll grab more of this. While all of these have been circular, we're going to have some elongated lights on the side of here, You can see them in the reference photo. Really like them. It's unique. And I think that while it doesn't stand out to too great of a degree, it works really well for our reflections at the bottom, which, by the way, all of these essentially have an area for them down here at the bottom. This one is actually here. This one is here. We do need some lights for these areas as well on our pillars. Going to have to move a little bit of this reflection just because I had it slightly too much to the right. And we'll have another one in here. Don't worry though, I will base the traceable off the correct finished version, not what I accidentally initially did. That said, wonderful thing about acrylics is that we can just re-layer over everything and make it the way we really want it to be. It's a very, very forgiving medium. One that encourages you to try things, make mistakes, learn from them, make it better. Love that. Really lets you get and stay creative with the process. I'm essentially looking for areas in my reflection that I'm yet to apply these to, and the areas in which they are in the reference photo, transferring them down here, starting obviously with the non-prominent ones from the vehicles, because we will have plenty of those very, very shortly. There we are. Yeah, not adding too much light to the left and the right hand sides, but just a little bit so that they still fit, so that they feel cohesive. And then we can also add hints of reflections there as well. Now for these fun areas. So we'll grab a bit more paint. I'm going to look for the largest spots, which are here, here, and here. We'll start here. I'm going to begin in the middle of where I want that light to be. And you know what? At this point, I think we can move in. So you can see the details, the blending, and all of that now that we've kind of established where things are. So a little bit up close, grabbing a bit more paint because in the process of moving everything, that did start to dry. We'll reapply some pigment right there. Still have a lot of pigment on my brush, and to blend out, I need little amounts of pigment. So I'll continue to take this off, looking above my reflections for different areas. There we are, just again, looking up at that photo. This one's supposed to be larger, and I am starting to run out of paint, which is good. So as I run out of paint, I'm going to work the edge. Just move that paint out as best I can, attempting to be soft with my brush and slowly get something that is less and less opaque. Now, I am going to go back and need to grab a bit more water. Wipe off the excess so the brush is just damp. And this should help me in the process of blending it out relatively softly. I'm still going to have some brush strokes, and I like that because it makes it look again a bit more painterly, but also it gives it a bit of an ethereal look, I find. Though you can do a softer blend if you use your finger, as you can see there. That said, I'm going to want these to be quite a bit larger. There we are. So, taking the excess pigment off my brush, making it nice and damp, blending out. Something you're going to want to make sure is that all of these and everything else is dry in this process, because if they're not, you are going to move that paint, and probably dramatically so. Again, this is something that's going to be built up over time. We do want these to get a whole lot bigger. This one being the largest. And I like to make them smaller than they need to be initially, purposefully, because it's a lot easier to make them larger than it is to make them smaller. And it's one of those things where you're kind of looking at all of them and asking yourself, are they balanced? And if not, you correct them until they are. And often the easiest way of correcting is through making them bigger. And we're just trying to make that process as easy as we can. You can see that there's almost this light that reflects off the road and connects them all. When we add color to this, it's going to get a lot more lively. But until then, we'll continue just having some fun. These essentially almost all connect to a point. So we'll just enlarge them until we get there. I'm not sure if you can hear the brush on the canvas. Getting a little painting ASMR in here, I suppose. Just trying to make this a good, relaxing experience. There we are. Slowly getting there. You can see that I take that new paint and essentially add it to all of the centers of the ones that I want to make larger. Ideally, it's to the ones that are already dry, but it doesn't have to be. And we can also take this pigment while we're waiting for it to dry a little bit and rework it into our reflections, just ensuring that they are as bright as they need to be. And I do like to wait 10-15 seconds before I go back and I move out that pigment, just because if it does dry a hint, it's a lot easier to get this technique in. And a lot of that, figuring it all out, is kind of intuitive, something you learn over time. But this is a great way of practicing it because we have so many of these little lights that you can kind of start to gauge that time frame and how it works best. Continuing, again, I essentially want these to merge. So I'll put it in the middle. I'll wait 10-15 seconds. In the meantime, maybe a little bit more over there. A little bit more over there. Again, we can use our finger. You can see the difference of effects. But now let's head back into these areas. Connecting in the middle. Dissolving as we get towards the edges. think I need quite a bit more right through there. Here as well. Not necessarily with the middle area, but the glow itself. The semi-transparent portion. I want to paint it right now, but I know I need to wait. Just a couple more seconds. And you can't really see it drying. Again, it's more of a intuitive thing. You've just worked with the paint before, you know how it works, you know how long it takes to dry in your area. And that's going to change depending upon things like your humidity. I know that when I paint in the summer, it's different from how I paint in the winter, just with wait times. But I really like that actually. I think it makes it fun. It's this extra element to painting that we can practice and get better at. And in Canada, in Ontario, we have some cold winters and we have some hot summers, and it's just a lot of variety. Currently in the cold winters category. Very, very chilly. Great time to stay in and do a lot of painting. There we go. You can see that I'm slowly building out that center, trying to make it so that there isn't really a super noticeable circle in the middle, that it is just this glow that moves outwards. And with this, by the way, we can go and we can tap that onto the middle and then use our pinky or deliver that glow elsewhere with our brush. Same way. Slowly just building it out. Again, applying all of this wet paint, but not doing the blend yet. Wet paint, not doing the blend yet. Doing a little bit of a blend because I'm essentially just left with water at this point. And now I'm moving it out. There we are. Nice glow on everything. Now, of course, we do have other lights in the form of street lights. So adding pigment to the top here, pigment to the top here, pigment to that right there, a bit more over here. Again, expanding. We were very focused in that central area, as that's where we really want the eye to be. And to be honest, we can still continue correcting that. We will. But in the meantime, I do want to work on these. Now, this right here and this right here are going to be tricky, because down here we have a lot of other grays to distract from the brush strokes. Here we just have that dark background. So we want this to look fairly clean. Brush strokes are fine, but not in a grand abundance. We want a glow, but nothing that kind of gets too far out there. There we go. Just don't rush this part of the process. We also saved it for this point in the painting so that we could practice essentially elsewhere with our glows before we got to this, because they are the most noticeable. You can see that I'm really using my pinky finger for this application with the addition of the brush. It's very much both, and intentionally that way, just because it does require that extra care. You can see that I'm getting a nice movement out with the brush, but having difficulties getting that soft edge without my finger. And we can build that up a couple of times to really turn it into what we want it to be. Though do be careful again, because your finger and the oils from it can make an area difficult to apply paint. There we go. Nice glows up at the top. And this bottom area has had a lot of time to dry, so we can go back in. I know we're spending a lot of time on the just little glows here before we get to the glazing portion, but I promise you it's worth it. We've spent a lot of time working on everything else. We don't want to rush this and kind of make that in vain. Of course, it's acrylic, so we can just work it back if we need to, but much better if we don't have to, right? Again, using that finger technique. Really big fan. Yet to really do the streetlights. There we go. So now we have our base layer complete. We can go back and re-add in details, even post color, but the next step is adding color. Now we'll be doing this with a glaze. We need to ensure that our painting as a whole is completely dry before we do this, and we will run through all of the colors, but this will be a really fun step for those of you who do want to interject color. You don't have to. Leaving the painting gray, I think, can look fantastic, but it really is personal preference, and I do want to show you how we can turn a gray image into something vibrant and full of life, just like this. So, jumping back into the canvas and the palette, we now have a turquoise green here. I have a cadmium red, medium hue, a cadmium orange, and a cadmium yellow deep hue. You don't need the turquoise green. I recognize it's not a casual common color. You could use something like an ultramarine blue or a cerulean blue. They will give you different hues, but it'll be similar enough with what we have here to render something quite nice. Now, with that, I'm going to be taking my 1-inch flat-headed brush, making it quite damp, in new clean water. We don't want to use the gray muddy water at this point, especially with these new colors. But with that, let's get you a bit closer to the canvas and we'll start applying our first glaze. Now, creating this essentially means taking our pigments, making them very thin via water, and then applying a wash, which adds and changes hue, but doesn't really impact the value much, so how bright or dark it is, or the actual line work. So we're creating very, very thin layers of color over time with the addition of water. Now, predominantly through the center here, I'm going to be using a lot of my turquoise green. So we'll take some of that, we'll move it to a clean spot on our palette, but this is far too thick to work with, so I'm going to take off the excess paint, dip my brush in some water, bring the water back over to the palette, and I'll spread that out to the point where it looks like we have some watercolor. And you can kind of see that as I move the palette around, just how thin that pigment really is. Now I'm going to take the excess off of my brush yet again, go back, grab that, and now I'm going to work that on here, recognizing that all of these are going to have that blue, and it's going to work down here. I call it blue. It's a turquoise green, technically, as noted, but it definitely resembles that of a blue. Now we're going to have it stretch all the way to the edge. We'll have it just come down there. I want the majority of this to have that blue. So we'll work it down as well. Again, it's not hyper saturated. We can make it more so saturated as we add layers, but we'd want to do that gradually over time rather than right now, because if we tried to do it in a singular layer, we'd probably augment the actual values and make it so we weren't just painting on color, which is truly our goal here, right? So we'll just work that down on the bottom. Also, again, it's imperative that the canvas is fully dry when you go in to do this, otherwise you will move around all of your wet paint. Now I'm trying to be relatively careful of this right here as well as this because they are going to have different colors rather than our turquoise green. We're going to have a lot of different colors in the light, but even the ones up here are going to have that turquoise green. And we can try to blend that out to a good degree. That way we don't have any hard stops with our color. And this is something we can blend wet into wet if we want, or wet into dry as we rotate through different colors. We're also eventually going to go back and add more titanium white to this because we are covering it with quite a bit of pigment. So don't worry too much about that. Added quite a bit of pigment there, so I'm going to try to work it horizontally and vertically till we have the desired amount. But you can see how we're slowly working color onto the canvas. It's starting to look nice. We can also rip off color if we want by just making the brush void of color, but also very wet. We can kind of scrape and push pigment about, so I was able to remove it from that area right there. We can also remove it from the centers of these if we just want them to be brighter. We can work reductively, like that. Essentially like using an eraser. But again, we can also go over these with titanium white again later, so it's not something you have to really prioritize or worry about while it's wet. That said, I like what we have for a lot of the blue. I think we'll just do a little bit more, maybe in some windows over here. I'm just looking over the reference photo, perhaps in the background here. Not too much. We're just trying to spread it out so that it's throughout the piece and therefore cohesive. There we are. Avoiding these lights because they're going to be more of an orange, more of a gold. Yeah. And again, we can use our finger to spread that out should we want to, but I'm really trying to not overdo it. Here, I'm removing a little bit in the middle of this just to give us back some of that highlighted reflection. All a balancing act, right? So I like that a lot. I'm going to make my brush quite clean. I'm going to head over to my orange. We'll move that to a clean spot. Again, make it very watery. There we go. And this side of the painting is really quite orange, as are a couple of these lights. So let's start right here. Washing that on. As you can see, nice and easy. We can do it to those, and then we'll take off the orange from our brush. Make our brush just clean with water. And then we can rip off some of the middle. Make it a bit brighter again. And now I think I'll blend the orange out into the blue a little bit. Again, it is technically a green, but I think it looks a bit more like a blue. Now, we'll take more of this orange. We'll head over here and essentially, just looking at my photo, this is orange. And we'll diversify the oranges with reds and yellows after, but orange is just a very safe base. And then we'll apply it to the entirety of this, the whole building. Then we'll need some more to incorporate here, to incorporate here, and here. Going over it a second time, building up that saturation. We'll also have it move upwards and slowly dissipate. So I have very, very little left on my brush, which is why I'm feeling safer moving up in that direction. I want to grab some red, make that much more thin. And with this, I want to apply it through here, have it blend up into these. That's really pretty. I like that a lot. And because that worked so well, let's make this one a bit more red. And have that blend down into the orange as well as the blues. When you start overlapping your colors, that's when they really start to get beautiful. You can see we have these interesting combinations. We'll get more red. We're going to head down towards the bottom area here. Work it up into the blues. Recognize I'm slightly off canvas, or off camera, apologize. Move back up. Love glazing. You can do so many creative things with it. Again, ripping off some of the paint in the middle. Starting to come together. We'll grab a bit more red. We'll add that to the right hand side and in some of the more shadowy areas of the orange. There we go. We're also going to get red on the left hand side and bookmark essentially a lot of our colors in the center using this. There we go. But I do really love the combination that we have down here. So we'll also grab some of our green. Do a bit of a blend. Have to be careful. I almost had enough paint on here to start changing the values. And again, in that scenario, we can just rip paint right off and apply it again in later layers once it's dried a little bit. But we do need more orange for over here. We still haven't even touched the yellow. There we are. Trying to go under the building for the most part. Being relatively loose though. You can make it exact. You can make it very intentional. But again, I like when it's a little more painterly. It's a term I've used quite a bit in this lesson, but I think it's one that has a lot of credence. Very specifically here. Really trying to play with my colors. Now, let's put the brush down. Let's pick up the liner brush. Going to make it nice and damp. Grab some of that cadmium yellow deep hue. About 1/3 of that in titanium white. And I'm going to add to some of these warmer lights that we have over here, as well as directly in their reflections. This is one of those things where we're working not with a glaze, but as an additive layer, something you can always go back and add, something you can always go back and do. And this is just going to add a lot of additional variety. Just working it towards the edges of that right there, not necessarily the inside of it. You can glaze on the yellow, but yellow is inherently very thin, and we'll get the most natural hue of it by actually painting it on. Let's grab some extra titanium white, by the way. Mix it with a hint of our yellow. Go back into the center of these, because we did start to lose the center through all of the added layers. While glazing is typically not meant to distort your pre-established values, when you do a lot of them, it can. So we're just keeping it clean. Nice and tidy. Something else I want is more blue up there. Now here, as you can see, I'm actually still working with my liner brush. Because it has such long bristles, you can work on its side. And admittedly, I had too much not watery paint on my brush. So, going to rip this off by really working that area. And while I was just noting about the convenience of the liner brush, we have a lot of paint on there. How do we take off a lot of paint? We use the 1-inch. Just like that. Saved. That's why we don't have to worry. Which is very nice. We added a lot of color elsewhere, so we could go back and add more to the top. This light should be red. So we'll just grab some of that. Grab some of that. Blend it out. Find a nice mix between the blue up top, the blue on the bottom, and then our reds right here. But our reds are looking rather soft. Going to go over it a couple of times. And we can see another one right over here. Working my brush over softly to get a bit more of a blend. I just looked over at the camera. We've been painting glazes for 15 minutes. Hope that you're still enjoying the process. I feel like there's just so much to do in a piece like this. Glazing more of the sides right there. Really adding color to everywhere. In the very least, a little bit. I'm going to put that down. Head back to my liner brush. We will grab our red, a little bit of titanium white. That'll render more of a pink, but something that's nice and thick. We can go into these actual lights. Love that. Love that. We can go into the sides of our reflections. There we go. Try not to overdo it, but I am having fun adding. Let's grab some extra titanium white, just a hint of that red. Go back into the center. Build this up a bit more. Again, this is one of our primary areas of focus, so we do want it to be prominent. There we go. Let's grab some titanium white and some of our turquoise green, or cerulean blue, or ultramarine blue, depending upon what you decide to use. I just like a touch of green in my cities. Just feel like it's very fitting. Grab a bit more. You can see I'm kind of working my way along the edge here, re-interjecting these highlights, which we've probably muted to a point over these application processes. There we go. Rebuild up those lights in the middle. Get back to that finger painting. Oh, it's really coming together. I love that. Really goes to show that in the beginning, when your acrylic paintings look rough, look unfinished, it's because they are unfinished. And if you just keep working on it, you just keep pushing, keep layering, you get to something you really love. I've been excited to paint this one for a while, but I wanted to do the more wintry scenes in the months of December and January. So, kind of been holding out and thinking about this one a lot. Nice to finally have it on canvas. Again, continuously going back to different areas, redelivering these highlights. Starting to build that life. You can also tap on a variety of different colors down here, should you want to. And you can glaze on darker pigments like a Mars Black if you want to darken a certain area. There are a lot of different options throughout this. Also, I think it's safe to say that things are getting nice and cohesive, but I've been painting pretty closely to the canvas, and that can be dangerous because we can hyper focus on individual little areas rather than thinking about it as a whole. And in those scenarios, different portions can become over detailed, over saturated, just not where the rest of the piece is. So, how are we going to remedy that? As soon as I'm done with a couple of these applications, we're going to move the camera back, and then we'll continue painting from a little bit more of a distance, which typically is slightly harder, but it does randomize your strokes, which is great. so that you don't end up with having something that's very visually samey. And again, it ensures things can be nice and cohesive. So, stepping back, I think that we are at a very promising point. I do like how it's balanced for the most part. I'm actually very, very happy with it, but there are some touch-ups we can do. And I want to show you how we can go back and re-interject entire, essentially, lanes of highlights without going through the process of painting a gray and then also going over glazing it after it's already dry. So here we're going to be using the liner brush, and I want more of this a bit higher up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my turquoise green. I'm going to grab about an equal mixture of my titanium white, grab about half that in my Mars black, and I'll mix up a fairly gray version of our turquoise green. Now this is actually quite a saturated pigment, so I will opt to double up on the titanium white and the Mars black, just like so, till I find something that looks like the edge of what I have here. And I think that is, while dark, really nice. We'll just add some extra titanium white, go in, and that should be perfect. So going here, I look at that and I say, okay, in the photo it's right up in between those, and then it works its way throughout here as well. So I'm just going in with those same horizontal small little taps. I know that it's quite far away, but I think it's still relatively visible. You can even go in with a heavier Mars black version for the edges. Yet again, if you want to simplify it, just like that. But we also want to highlight at least the center portions. So with that, we grab the titanium white, make a brighter variant, but again, one that still has those grays and whatnot incorporated. My brush is fairly damp, but not damp enough. I wasn't able to get the smaller markings that I wanted to, and I could tell that relatively quickly, so we just went back, grabbed some extra water. Now we're working that in. I don't want it to be too prominent, but I do essentially want it to lead down into there and have a bit more of this more green highlight on the right hand side. It's not quite as bright as what we have over here, intentionally so. We can also use this to kind of play with these pre-established ones as well, build them out should we want to. Use it to just tap on little highlight areas. I like that a lot though. Something else I want to do is take more of that titanium white, hint of this, and rebuild more of our highlights towards the middle, very specifically in this area, as this is where we want the eye to end up. So we can go back to the middle of these, we'll go back to the reflections, and this is essentially touch-up season here in the painting. Everybody's touch-ups are going to look a little bit different. We're all going to have areas that we want to further focus on. But I think for a lot of us it's going to be playing with the way these all expand, ensuring that they are going down to different lengths, that they have different widths, that they blend into one another. We can go back and we can glaze. So much freedom to play with in our acrylics. And I'm also adding this almost misty highlight that's going to stretch all the way across the top of the horizon in the road there. I'll grab a bit more. I'm trying to look at this from a distance, see where I want additional highlights. I do want this to expand a little bit. But with that, we are getting towards the end, and as you know, I do like to give out a little keyword, little code word you can use in the comment section to note that you were one of what is normally only 13% to get to the end of the video. It's a little badge of honor, essentially, that I'll see and recognize, and everybody else who gets this far will see and recognize. And you can either leave the word or you can incorporate it in a sentence. But I think today's word will be atmosphere. I always feel like these are incredibly atmospheric pieces when you have the rain, the reflective roads, and often when I paint them, that's really what I aim for. It's not necessarily realism, it's to capture an atmosphere. So, love to see that in the comments if you made it this far. Also, big thank you for just watching, being a part of this. Love it when people are still dedicated to the medium to the point where they'll watch a 2-hour lesson, maybe more. These started as what I wanted to be hour-long lessons, just very digestible, but the more we kind of dove into the series, the more I wanted to teach, and the more complicated the lessons became, and now sometimes they're 4 hours long. But I figure the more information, the better, right? So I hope you enjoy the fact that these are a bit longer than what you'll typically find on YouTube, but that it's just as full of information as you can possibly find. Always really do want you to leave these feeling not only inspired and excited, but also like you have a lot of new information to incorporate in your own pieces, and not only just information to work into this one, but again, information that you can take and interject into future works that you have that are different from this. I always like to teach the ideas, not just the actual application process on this individual piece, right? I do think that's important. Also, big thank you, of course, to everybody supporting the channel directly up over on Patreon. This channel is predominantly community funded, and it is because of you that we're able to do this lesson, that I was able to take my time and actually do the lesson twice so that it could be just right, as I noted earlier. If it wasn't for you, I'd probably feel more inclined to rush these out, and it's just really nice that I can ensure that they are the best lesson they can be before I end up releasing them. So thank you for not making me rely on ad revenue and that sort of thing, not having to put 20 ads in the middle of these videos. I can find that a little annoying, so I'm always really happy that we don't have to do that here. But yeah, if you're new to the channel and you haven't already, you can check out the Patreon. Up there you can get the traceable for this. There are gridded versions, non-gridded versions. Easy to make the transfer for the architectural subjects. You can also get the reference photos. And the one that I've shown in the video a couple of times is in the black and white scale. But there's also going to be the colored version, so you can print both off and test directly on. Also just link the reference photo in the video description. But up there again, you can also get access to all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. There are a bunch of ebooks full of traceables, and we also again have the exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their artwork and you can see different renditions of the lessons that are done on this channel. It's a very supportive community I'm incredibly proud of, community that always impresses me. And I also see some paintings, versions of these, that I actually prefer over my own, and I say, you know what, that's a really good technique, or that's It's a really good idea, and I find it actually helps inspire me and makes these lessons better as well. So always nice to surround yourself with creative, inspiring people. So again, big thank you to everybody up on that group. I know we talked about it earlier, but I'm very grateful to have you be a part of this community. I'm you can tell I'm starting to talk slower because I'm kind of analyzing little pieces of it, right? Trying to figure out what I might want to alter. But you know what? I think I'm just very, very happy with where it is, how it turned out. So, you know what? There we have it. Thank you for being a part of this painting journey. I hope, again, you feel inspired, motivated, but also you feel like you've learned quite a bit and you're ready to go out and create your own pieces. And I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you have a wonderful time working on this. Remember to keep hydrated in the painting process. Remember to have some snacks. That way your hands don't get too shaky. Remember to use your pinky finger to ground your hand. And whenever I talk about all the little things to remember, I feel like I have a list of 100 things because we just talk about so much in the lesson. But you know, you've been here. You're ready. I believe in you. And you should believe in yourself. When things are awkward in the beginning, don't worry about it. That's just acrylics. Push through, and you can make something wonderful today. So I'll see you soon with a new lesson. Thank you for being here. Subscribe if you haven't. And again, as always, stay creative.